Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kyle Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Network, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists and innovators that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
Typically, when we imagine space activities, it's kind of the Apollo era, boots on the moon or giant space stations. It's explorations, it's things almost by definition that are completely apart from normal day-to-day business. But what I think is changing today with the introduction of the private sector coming in and making space activities more routine and cheaper and unlocking all kinds of new capabilities, I think what's changed is that it's forcing us to reevaluate as a society, what is space and what is it good for? It's really just a place out there where we can put technologies that do certain things. There's no prescribed way to do space. And we've seen companies lean in to, especially to what Matt mentioned, data that's coming through space and data that's being captured from space to better execute their business models, to execute new and bold strategies. And it's really been exciting to be at this moment in particular where we're at an inflection point of what's possible in space and seeing more and more value being created from there.
That was Brendan Rosseau, co-author along with Matthew Weinzierl of Space to Grow, Unlocking the Final Economic Frontier. Wow, this episode is a journey. Metaphorically speaking, into the beyond, outer space itself. We are joined today by Matthew and Brendan, two experts in the space industry, each contributing their expertise in distinct ways. Matthew is the Joseph and Jacqueline Elbling Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School and the Senior Associate Dean and Chair of the MBA program, where his award-winning research and teaching focus on economic policy and the business of space. He is the founder of the Economics of Space project at HBS and serves as an advisor on space to government agencies, companies, and investors. Brendan is a recognized leader in the space industry. He works in strategy at Blue Origin, the space company wholly owned by Jeff Bezos. He previously served as a teaching fellow and research associate at Harvard Business School and as a consultant to the U.S. Space Force. He has degrees in economics and astronomy from Williams College and is dedicated to using space technologies to bring about a more prosperous, peaceful, equitable, and exciting future. In this episode, we venture, dare I say, even beyond space. We explore the boundaries and intersections of fundamental laws of economics within the context of the rapidly developing space industry or market. And what really popped for me were the insights we can glean about how other markets have and will evolve. The automobile industry, e-commerce, precision farming, and potentially the economies around AI or blockchain. If we understand these underlying economic forces, I believe we can more accurately anticipate when and how such new markets will emerge. And as heard in the highlighted clip, in the case of space, it might be coming much sooner than most of us outside of the space industry think. In this episode, we discuss how the space industry and space technology have the potential to and will disrupt many businesses and industries as we know them today. The fascinating evolution of NASA as a government-funded R&D entity into a private sector market creator, acting as a customer of many customers so they can pave the way for space innovation. The fundamental economic laws that govern how the space industry will evolve and how markets here on Earth will evolve as well. The near-term financial opportunities you may not be thinking of that are providing a kind of economic bridge from private sector actors who need near-term profits and long-term players like the government or maybe some large corporations who have the funding and patience to pursue the very long-term opportunities offered by the moon and Mars. How the rapid formation of the space industry will directly impact companies in nearly every sector and in your sector, even those that have no obvious connection to space. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Weinzierl and Brendan Rosseau. Matt, Brendan, thank you so much for being here. It is great. I've really enjoyed preparing for this podcast. In addition to reading the book, I listened to all kinds of content that you have out there, and it really flipped my mind on what space actually is and what the near-term opportunities are. So it is a real gift to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for being here, Kai. I can't tell you how glad we are, especially to speak to people who spend their days thinking about strategy. It's Brendan and one of our core goals is that this book would reach exactly your audience who's thinking around the corner. So thanks for having us.
Yeah. And to bring the academic, big thinking, big picture view, and then the strategist view of like what is happening now, the zoom out, zoom in is really special. It's good that you guys teamed up together. I always start with the same two questions just to warm us up a little bit. I'd like each of you to answer the question. Let's start with Brendan. Complete the sentence for me. If you really know me, you know that.
Oh,
this can have nothing to do with your work at all.
Oh, man. If you know me, you know that I speak French and love everything that France related. My last name is Rosseau. And so I've got some French family that moved here before World War I. But one of my favorite things to do is head back over there and see where my roots came from. So it's one of my favorite things.
And did you learn French like in school?
Mais oui.
Excellent.
But you lose it, so you got to practice it every day.
Yeah,
it's amazing. Yeah. It's like it's almost like reaching for a tool where you haven't spoken French in like a year, and you're like, oh, it's definitely right there. I can just grab it and use it right away. And it turns out the tool has rusted, so you need to
right. You got to keep it sharp and. Yeah, I've been using a platform called Preply, and I just do once a week, just like a 1 hour Zoom German and 1 hour Zoom Spanish, just to keep it going. Yeah. Excellent. And Matt, what about you? What, if you really know me, you know that.
Well, if you really know me, you know that I love lakes. I grew up in Minnesota, land of 10,000 lakes, although most Minnesotans will tell you that's an understatement. And so I think for those reasons, if I can spend time at a lake, I'm a happy guy.
That's awesome. Awesome. And so we'll stay with you, Matt. Second question, what's your definition of strategy? I ask this of all of our guests, and we always get a different answer. So whatever you say is right.
I was so glad you asked, because I'm not a strategy professor, so I've never had to put into words how I think about this question, how I think of this concept. But it's funny, in addition to working on space, I am currently serving as the faculty chair of the MBA program at HBS, so I spend a lot of time actually trying to think about and execute strategy. And so I tried to reflect on how I would define it. And so here's what I came up with, which is it's about choosing core objectives and then deciding how to use scarce time and resources to achieve them. So nothing particularly surprising in that one, but that's how it's been for me anyway.
Well, I think the scarcity is particularly apropos for the topic of space, right? Because you're working in which access to resources is difficult or often impossible.
A lot of our startups are struggling with that all the time. So.
Yeah. Excellent. Great. Brent?
Well, Matt's definition, I completely agree with this. So I don't know how much I can improve on it. But I would say for me, though I'm early in my career, one area that I've seen strategy be incredibly important and sometimes overlooked is choosing the activity of choosing the right goal, a very specific goal that kind of makes you or your company or your organization what it really can be. A lot of times I've seen organizations kind of hand wave through so we want to be the best at this. And the organizations I've really loved that I've been proud to be part of are the ones that get very specific and say, we are going to be, the best at, either manufacturing this specific thing or doing this specific thing in this kind of way because it reflects the kind of people we want to be. And just the specificity, for me, it lets it sink in a lot more, trickle through the organization. And so whenever it's time for me to execute a strategy or choose goals, I never skip that that component of it.
That's great. Yeah, because I think that'll be interesting. Eventually, we'll talk a little bit about what is it that Blue Origin wants to be, and is that different than what SpaceX wants to be, and are the paths, because it seems like the paths are different, but are the destinations different as well, and others that are playing. Good. So let's talk about space first. I think that, like me, as I was preparing for this, a lot of our listeners are thinking, when they think space, they're thinking, I don't know, some decade or decades from now, there are some people on Mars. And you teach a class with students, executive ed people as well, and they're talking about near-term opportunities. So first, just kind of make it real for us. Talk to us a little bit. What are those near-term entrepreneurial opportunities that you encourage students to look at? How can we make money on this now?
That's a great question. And Let me just say, I'm glad you mentioned our students because it really is vital to what we've been trying to do. I'm fortunate to teach at Harvard Business School. Brendan worked with me for 3 years there on our research and the writing about space, the book, Space to Grow, that recently came out and what we're going to talk about in part today as well. But we also created this course that we've now taught for 3 years to MBA students. And there's about 95 students in the class each year, and only a dozen or so of them have direct experience in the space sector coming into school. And so very much to your question, most of the ones in the room are curious about how they might use space in their careers, whatever industry they find themselves in, right out the door, right? They're about to graduate. How can they use it? And we really like to stress that point, that space is already completely essential to our way of life. I think most of us take that for granted, and we can, explore various ways in which that's true, but also the expanding reach of space in terms of internet satellite constellations, Earth observation, as we often refer to it, data through and from space, has the potential to transform essentially every industry that your listeners work in and help to lead. And so we are really eager to get folks, whether it's in agriculture or finance or even on the ESG side of things, to be thinking about how they might incorporate data through and from space into their business model.
Yeah, I think one of the traps that we see folks run into when they think about space is typically when we imagine space activities, it's kind of the Apollo era, boots on the moon or giant space stations. It's explorations. It's things almost by definition that are completely apart from normal day-to-day business. But what I think is changing today with the introduction of the private sector coming in and making space activities more routine and cheaper and unlocking all kinds of new capabilities, I think what's changed is it's forcing us to reevaluate as a society, what is space and what is it good for? It's really just a place out there where we can put technologies that do certain things. That there's no prescribed way to do space. And we've seen companies lean in to, especially to what Matt mentioned, data that's coming through space and data that's being captured from space to better execute their business models, to execute new and bold strategies. And it's really been exciting to be at this moment in particular, where we're at an inflection point of what's possible in space and seeing more and more value being created from there.
So just to help us visualize that, can you give us an example of an existing or hypothetical soon revenue opportunity from data in space?
Oh, sure. So one of the examples that's often cited, so listeners who are familiar with space will have heard of it before, but think about the insurance industry and how they need to monitor the various assets they insure. Now, of course, you can send agents out to do that monitoring. You can try to leverage technology to do that, but especially if you're insuring assets at scale or that are remote, the ability to monitor those assets in a real-time, quick way, and increasingly in sophisticated ways. So your listeners might think, okay, yeah, I can get some grainy picture from space, but how's that actually going to help me? Turns out many startups have formed over the past decade that leverage increasingly sophisticated technology to measure things like moisture levels in soil and temperature and various emissions down even actually below the surface. They can penetrate even into the soil. And so insurance companies have a huge interest in being able to monitor their assets more efficiently and quickly. That's just one example.
Yeah, and another one is, and users might be, or listeners rather, might be familiar with this, is SpaceX's satellite constellation called Starlink. So it's a relatively new system. The first prototype satellites went up just in 2019, so only a few years ago. But already they've launched and put into orbit thousands of these, internet satellites into low Earth orbit. They provide high-speed connectivity to any point on the Earth, and that's may seem like kind of a mundane thing. We're used to being in Wi-Fi connectivity or at least internet connectivity, but huge parts of the Earth have no internet at all, and even fewer have high-speed connectivity. And so it's been an amazing thing to be able to provide at a moment high-speed internet connectivity to every part of the world, and it's just getting better every day. And we've seen companies, everything from Maersk, the shipping conglomerate, to United Airlines, to everything in between. There's now over 5 million users, and it's generating billions of dollars a year. And it's a really unique kind of value. For the moment, the main impact has been providing internet to places where has not been before. So kind of allowing us to do familiar things with internet access, just in maybe less familiar places. But in the long run, people are really excited about, what does this mean for 21st century infrastructure when we have a high speed, always online web of connectivity that truly blankets the globe. What does that mean for self-driving cars or drones or planes or everything in between? Could you have businesses that are fully autonomous? They're executed by machines that don't need to be operated by humans, regardless of where they are in the world. So we're not there yet, but we're at a really interesting inflection point where those kinds of conversations that maybe once were sci-fi seem a little bit less out there.
This is just so fun to talk about because there may be listeners out there who are thinking, yeah, okay, data, that's interesting. I'm not really sure mobile internet's that useful to me or Earth observation. But if you're in an industry that makes, physical objects, I mean, this is a little farther down the line, but we've been talking just about data. One of the other areas people are really excited about in space is manufacturing. And this has been a dream that's been held for decades in space, but we're finally getting to the point, we hope, where the costs of doing it and the capabilities of doing it are going to really change and be able to drive some value for various sectors. A fun thing perhaps for the audience to think about is the idea that, what is special about space? Brendan made a great point. Like, space is just a place. We talk about that a lot in the book. It's like Latin America or anywhere else. It's a place to do things increasingly, but it does have its own natural resources like other places might. And one of those is microgravity. It's really hard to generate microgravity at scale for long periods of time on Earth. And so does that change the manufacturing processes, the R&D processes for things that might be really quite valuable and therefore create opportunities that, again, thinking around the corner a bit, 5-10 years from now, It might be a reality.
And so then I'm thinking about, if we imagine, I'm just visualizing these factories and stuff getting transported up and down and all the products that now can be made more economically or with better performance or that couldn't be made before. There are a whole bunch of services around that and other providers around that. What are some of those that might emerge?
Well, exactly. The picks and shovels. Yeah, no, that's right. There's a booming industry these days in the startup world in space to provide what's called satellite servicing or moving satellites to different orbital, the sort of thing you're talking about. So one nice example is refueling. Right. So we've sent satellites up with carrying a certain amount of fuel they're going to need to maneuver and to operate over time. But what if you could kind of pull up a mobile gas station and refuel them so that they could extend their life and maybe provide some fix-its as well when you're there? That's a whole new sector.
Yeah, a lot of what we're seeing being created in space today, there was first in the 2000s and 2010s, there was a disruption in the launch industry. So it's the indispensable capability to get into space is launching a vehicle into orbit. And we saw companies like SpaceX, but SpaceX in particular, bring the cost way down, 90% lower than what it cost during the space shuttle era. And then now they're working to bring those costs down again. So we first saw a disruption in launch, and then as that wave kind of trickled out, then satellite companies started thinking, wait a minute, launches are a lot more frequent, they're a lot more cheap. What if we rethought how we built satellites? And then we saw a lot of cheaper, smaller, more numerous, kind of that move fast and break things approach came into the satellite industry, which really transformed it. We're in the midst of that change today. And then now we're seeing even larger changes when it comes to commercial space stations or beyond, or, okay, these satellites are going to need servicing. We're seeing those ripples of disruption move further and further. And it's really exciting because they're building up the capabilities and infrastructure that it takes to execute more and more sophisticated, more low cost, more, high cadence space activities. And for most people, they might just think, okay, that's great. I'll see it on the news sometime, some cool space images. But it's really the start of bringing about capabilities that really matter to folks back here on Earth. One of the critical changes that I think we have to get across here is that with the introduction of market forces in the past 20 years, more and more of space activity is being driven by space companies. And that's a fundamental change from everything we've known about space through NASA's history and beyond. That matters for us because if space companies are leading the way, then they need customers. They need customers by definition to stay alive. And the vast majority of these space companies are not going after some in the sky, let's go terraform Mars or let's go do, some crazy thing that isn't super relevant to folks on the ground. They're interested in how do we serve businesses where they are today? How do we provide a capability that, terrestrial businesses don't even know they need yet, but could be hugely disruptive in the future. So that for us is part of what makes this so exciting. And it feels like we're at a moment where enough time has passed that it's definitely real. We've seen businesses lean in and normal folks and organizations kind of benefit from what's going on in space, but also there's so much that is exciting that's ahead of us. So it's a great time for listeners of this podcast to be thinking about space.
Yeah, no, this is popping several things for me. One is if we think about, say, the founders of Blue Origin and SpaceX, they've kind of all both have this model of, do something small, make money to fuel the next thing, to fuel the next thing. So we start seeing this near-term opportunity that maybe didn't exist before. So that's why the government sort of had to monopolize the funding of these very long-term things. But what has changed? You talk about the NASA viewing itself less as the funder and more as a customer. Just talk to me, like, how did that come to be, and what's the mindset like from, I don't know what you call it, monopolist to market maker?
It's a fascinating story, actually. I'm really glad you asked about it, because I think a lot of us, including Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and a lot of the folks who are driving the space industry over today, grew up in an era when you think of space, you think of the space shuttle, or maybe you think of the Apollo missions, you think of big government-led space programs. And for the first 50 years of the space age, that's what it was. In fact, there's an amazing quote from one of the early founders of SpaceX, Jim Cantrell. He says, in the early 2000s, he's looking back at the first 50 years of the space sector, and he says, "The great American space enterprise that defeated communism in defense of capitalism was and is operating on the Soviet economic model." And the irony of that was really quite poignant, that we had run this centrally commanded single driver space sector for so many years. And that worked wonders in its early days. I mean, you can't take away from the accomplishment of those first few decades in space, and even in the subsequent decades, amazing engineering achievements. But over time, that model started to show its age, and it started to show the weaknesses of not having market forces of competition and the price mechanism and various things that we all know drive efficiency and innovation. And so in the early 2000s, many of your listeners will remember the space shuttle had its second accident in 2003, second tragedy. And at that point, that was a crisis point for the general space enterprise. People realized we had to try something different. And so there was a little pilot program run out of NASA called Commercial Orbital Transportation Services that seeded some of these startups that have now grown into these massively important companies to resupply the International Space Station through a different model. And, you asked what changed, and I'll just highlight three key things that really shifted and that made this much more, as Brendan was saying, a market than it was before. The first is that NASA decided to be one customer among many. So just like you were saying, rather than being the only customer, they decided to tell these companies, look, we want to support you, but you should also build things that you can sell to other people. A second was that NASA decided to provide insight rather than oversight. So NASA has amazing people with amazing experience and ideas and expertise. They can help companies do the job better, but rather than monitoring them, they want to support them with the insight. And then the third was it sounds kind of technical or in the weeds, but it was a shift from contracting that provided a margin over a cost, so cost plus contracting it's called, to a fixed price method of contracting, where you pay these companies to deliver something for a certain amount of money. And you can imagine all the incentive changes that engenders, and really brought market forces in that we've been now living 20 years since, seeing those market forces play out.
So I just want to double click on that so I understand. What I'm envisioning is, whereas before it was a long-term contract with Lockheed Martin that was billions of dollars, now it is, I'll buy from, I don't know, short-term contract, more transactional, I guess. Is that what we're
typically what they think of as buying services? So before, NASA would say, we're going to build the space shuttle. And so we're going to contract out the manufacturing of, the door that goes to the crew hatch to, whoever. And so before, but they would give them as Matt mentioned, like a cost plus amount, so that they cover their cost plus a margin. And so they were supervising them. And that's how NASA did most of its business for most of its history. Now there's been a real push, especially since the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services, COTS, the program that essentially created SpaceX and so many other companies, because that's been so successful. Now there's a big push where NASA is hoping to acquire services and be one purchaser out of many of these services than others. So it's moving away from owning and operating the things that it doesn't have to. So when NASA wants a ride to space now to launch either crew or cargo or its fantastic satellites like the James Webb, it buys a launch like any other customer would. When it wants somewhere to put its astronauts, now as the International Space Station is getting retired, it's going to buy services from commercial space stations. Of course, there's things that NASA will always be the only institution doing. It's a public research focused institution. So when it comes to exploring the moon or doing all kinds of other things, basic science and R&D, NASA will be the one doing those. But the big change is that it's been looking at how do we incorporate the private sector as much as possible to do things more efficiently, more lower cost, and be more sustainable. So we don't just have these, kind of boots on the moon and then never to go again for the next 50 years outcomes like we had with Apollo.
Got it. I don't. This question I think is maybe not as important as the many other questions I want to get to, but I'm just curious, what caused that shift? Was there a change in leadership or economics, or why?
That's a great question. I mean, interestingly, you can go back to the 1980s, and maybe it's not surprising that under President Reagan, who was very big on free market forces, that there was even then a lot of interest in commercial space and in stimulating sort of private sector space activity. And there were various laws passed and some funding provided, and the little fits and starts of progress here or there. I think, like many, again, of the folks who listen to this who are focused on strategy will recognize sometimes it takes a crisis to really shift things. And I think that the second shuttle accident and the fact that we often say, the country that put men on the moon and brought them back in 1969, 40 years later, at the time, of course, after the moon landing, expectation was just imagine what we'll achieve in the next 40 years. But in fact, 40 years later, the United States was looking at a situation in which it couldn't put astronauts in orbit from its own soil, much less do some of the great things that were envisioned before.
Yeah, it often is that there's like a kind of a shift in mindset or perspective or metaphor that's emerging, and then there's a trigger that has the new mindset kind of take over, sort of like a Keynesian kind of revolution,
very
if
much
you will.
So.
But it was amazing because it was almost, I don't want to get too fluffy about it or philosophical, but it's amazing, not just in a space context, but if you think about organizational change, NASA was created in the way that we know NASA today, or the way that it existed for so long, was created to do a very specific thing. Obviously, it was born in the version we know today out of the space race in response to Sputnik and the first flight of Yuri Gagarin, and saying, we need to, show our force in space. We need to beef up America's space capabilities. And that obviously culminated in the moon landing. So it was created to do a very specific job, to mobilize immense national resources to serve the country at a time of really a national emergency, to execute the largest peacetime engineering project in human history, which Apollo still is. And that was fantastic. Obviously, it 10 out of 10 on that mark. But once the space race ended in the late 60s, and it was time to decide what to do next, is what in the book Matt and I call Act Two. That same model seemed to kind of break down a little bit. Instead of rallying the nation and marshaling an incredible amount of resources to execute a specific goal, which is something that governments can be very good at. Now for Act Two, which was the space shuttle and the International Space Station, the goal was all about, let's bring the astronautical costs out of astronautics. Let's make things cheaper. Let's make things more routine. Let's make things more user-friendly so that we can go to space more and more frequently and really benefit from all these potential use cases that we think there are in space. And if you notice that that's a tricky little switch in terms of the goals involved, and that's a pretty different ask out of a government organization. You're going from a set of goals where it could be very strong at, if you provide the resources, to one where, hey, maybe we should leverage the private sector a little bit more. And of course, the rest is history. It still took decades to in a real crisis, as Matt mentioned, to be able to introduce market forces in the way that we see it today.
Yeah, I talk about this market forces and the things that have to be in place for us to reduce market. And I think it has to do with more things than space, although space is big enough. But I live in Miami. We've got Messi here. If you look at how the Saudi government, they had a centralized, we're going to give you $1 billion. And then we put together this coalition of different players, whether it's Apple TV and others, and we kind of created a variable upside, kind of, it felt like more market force versus centralized. And then I think about, this is just uneducated from the outside in, I think about, I would think China, India, Russia are probably leaning less into a market force approach. I don't know. And I think that companies are shifting towards introducing market forces inside their companies as opposed to being a centralized, hierarchical, kind of centrally regulated, but allowing for more entrepreneurialism. So I just want to say that because I think that what we're talking about here has significant implications. I'd like to talk about what are the things that need to be in place? And you've laid out some. I have a list here that I came up with ahead of time. Public goods and free rider problem, negative externalities, incomplete and unclear property rights, thin or missing markets, information asymmetries, lack of standards and interoperability, coordination failures. Just as like a kind of a list of some things that you've talked about. Let's just talk about a couple of the things that are not in place maybe yet that need to be in place in order for us to really realize this market-based space.
No, that's
world.
great. Thanks. And, you're getting at, I'll talk about one specific example in a minute, but I want to just tie a bow on something for folks. One of the things we try to do in the book, if people are interested in taking a look at it, is bring some of the basic, most fundamental tools of economics to bear on understanding the space sector, to try to give people a bit of a foothold to understand all the complexity of what's going on. And we start actually with what's often considered the most important idea in economics, called the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. And the simplest statement of it is that under certain conditions, the equilibrium of a competitive market is efficient. So all that's really saying is that under certain conditions, and that's an important thing to say, you'll see why in a second, if you want to maximize the size of the economic pie, markets are the best way to do it. Markets are really good at efficiently using resources, something I'm sure all your listeners have personal experience with. The reason that's such an important starting point is, just as we were talking about, market forces are the big new thing in space. And they're the big new thing because they can produce this kind of efficiency and innovation and growth that we're all so excited about, why we're having this conversation today. And that's new. But the other part of that theorem is that this holds under certain conditions. And so many of the things you just mentioned are factors that sometimes cause markets not to be efficient on their own, ways that can hamstring markets from achieving that maximum economic pie, and sometimes can justify government intervention or various other ways of coordinating activity. And so a lot of our book and a lot of what we talk about and teach about and what a lot of people in the space sector think about are exactly those situations. Brendan, I'm sure, has a million he could mention. I'll just take 30 seconds or so on property rights because you mentioned it. And I think that's a really essential one. Of course, the foundation of any market activity is property rights, and it has lots of implications for space. So two are about resource mining in space, which I'm sure many of your listeners are kind of interested in. Are we going to mine asteroids? Are we going to mine the surface of the moon? Things like that. And then space debris, which is a big potential threat and something a lot of people are worried about. Both of those activities crucially, or solving the latter and taking advantage of the former, both crucially depend on property rights. And that's something we're still figuring out in space.
What property of what?
Exactly. So we have a treaty. You might wonder, what is the law of space at this point? And the main one is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which major spacefaring nations have signed on to, including the United States and at the time the Soviet Union, but thus Russia. And the Outer Space Treaty does one really important thing, or two really important things I'll mention on this score. First, it says that actually you cannot claim sovereignty over any territory in space. So people might think that the American flag on the moon is sort of a claim of sovereignty, and that's not what it is. The United States does not own any of the moon, and nor can we own asteroids or any of those. At the same time, it does allow, it actually requires that any activity that's licensed by a country is that country's responsibility in space. So when SpaceX or Blue Origin gets a license from the United States government to do its activity in space, the government is eventually responsible for that. And so that creates a bit of property rights at some level around the satellites that are up there in space and so on. But you can imagine that there's some slippage between the fact that we don't have property rights like we do here on Earth over territory and over space, and that we do kind of have property rights over objects in space. And so we're still trying to sort out, I think, as a collective, how we're going to navigate those different tensions.
So you're talking about the tragedy of the commons. Is that right? Just explain that to us.
Yeah, we can go in real deep on either of these or both of these. I mean, on space debris is totally fascinating. And a lot of your listeners will have seen the George Clooney movie where they almost get killed by the space debris. The trick with space debris is that just like any negative externality on Earth that your listeners might be thinking of with pollution, the costs to me of putting a satellite up in space don't include the extra risk that I put on all the other people operating in space by having my satellite in orbit. The explosive force of a little piece of space junk the size of a cherry is equivalent to a grenade exploding here on Earth because they're traveling at 17,000 miles an hour. And so there is a risk that as we get more satellites up in space, as there's more space debris up there, that you can get this cascade effect called the Kessler syndrome, where debris creates more debris and eventually could wipe out all the satellites that are operable in orbit, obviously with huge economic consequences. How do you solve a potential tragedy of the commons like that? How do you avoid it? One classic way that you would think to do it is to create property rights. So you could imagine sort of fencing off orbital space and giving people rights over different parts of it so they could then regulate the use of their little territories. But that's actually pretty hard to do in low Earth orbit, to fence off space. And so instead we have to rely on other mechanisms to try to avoid that tragedy.
And I think you mentioned standards before, so I'm happy to talk about one of the issues that's happening now. So part of the trend that's going on today with more and more satellites is we don't only want satellites to communicate up from the ground and back. Also, with thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit today, it's an order of magnitude increase from even just a decade ago. We want satellites to be able to communicate with one another and with other constellations of satellites as well. So the idea is that you can create this mesh of essentially computers floating in the sky that can communicate with one another and do all sorts of incredible things. But of course, that means that satellites built by different companies and for different purposes have to be able to communicate with one another. So and that creates a problem. You need a standard, and not everyone wants to coalesce around the same standard. This is actually an area where we saw the government be able to step in and play to its strengths as an organizer of economic activity, where there's a group within the Defense Department. It's called the Space Defense Agency, the SDA. It's a new organization that's entirely focused on speeding up acquisition and doing kind of cutting edge things in space. And they are building a constellation that for national security that has lots of different satellites that communicate with one another. And they instituted a standard for themselves so that one satellite could send a laser beam and communicate information to the other. And the nice thing was that without issuing a hard and fast requirement to all of the industry of saying, here's a mandate of how satellites are going to communicate, it's created a kind of natural consolidation where, because this is the standard that's being used for a major project, people tend to kind of be coalescing around this standard. So it's great. It's one of the big problems that we'll have to address in space if we're going to capture the complete size of the economic pie that we think exists, is coordination. There's a lot of value out there, but sometimes capturing value means you have to have a lot of different players pooling their risk and working together so that their work is greater than the sum of its parts. We see it in satellite communications. We see it in space stations. We see it from the Earth to the moon and beyond. And it's very exciting to be at a time today where there are so many companies working on this, companies that are working smarter and thinking together, that I think in the next few years, folks are going to be hearing more and more news about space. And it's not just going to be kind of out there news. It's going to feel more and more relevant. And I think that means there's opportunity for all of us.
That's great. So I know we only have a few more minutes with you, and I've got more questions that we have to cover, but luckily people should buy your book, and there's a lot of other content that you have created. Let's just zoom a little bit further out into the future. This race for standards, I think, Betamax and DVD, and this always been if I can own the standard, then I can raise switching costs, I can start concentrating, but then I don't need to innovate as much and I don't need to invest as much. So there's this kind of trade-off of, you got to let them make enough money that they're going to invest now. But how do you see it going? Are we going to have a duopoly of SpaceX and Blue Origin? And are we going to have concentrated, or are we going to have a very open marketplace with all the providers and the infrastructure providers and the like?
No, that's a really great question, Kai. And, we've talked about, you mentioned a long list of things you need for markets to function. And we've talked a little bit about a few of them, including property rights and price mechanism a little bit. We were talking about the COTS program and interoperability you guys were just talking about, but we didn't really talk about competition. And I think so I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of the key ingredients to really having a market work well. And space does kind of lend itself to concentration for some of the reasons you were hinting at there. The fixed costs of operating in space, at least historically, have been pretty high. And so that can lead to kind of a natural monopolistic setting. Also, I think we happen to live in an era when SpaceX moves faster than just about anybody would have ever imagined a company moving. And so they got out to a lead on some of the core activities in commercial space that has seemed almost insurmountable. And so a lot of concerns have been raised about whether they have too much market power. One thing I think, when we think about these questions, you're always looking for whether the leading company is creating value or just kind of trying to capture value. And it seems to us, at least, that SpaceX has continued to try to push the envelope on technology and creating value more broadly. I think, our perspective is that the leading space companies these days, not just SpaceX, but Blue and others, see the potential size of this market as so enormous that they'd rather grow it and then have a piece than try to just grab the biggest piece of themselves right now. But it is, I think, incumbent upon all of us and upon governments to nevertheless continue to encourage competition, subsidize the startups, try to make sure there's lots of people nipping at the heels of the leaders to keep them sharp and to be there to push prices down, not just costs. So that is luckily, I will say, I think governments around the world, the NASA, but also the Department of Defense, which is a huge funder of space in the United States, actually much larger than our civilian funding for space, also wants competition. They don't want to be dependent on any one provider over time.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how, and it's just hard to predict, as you say, when you're looking at a marketplace, it's harder to project how a marketplace will evolve than how a centrally controlled system will evolve. So we both came to space in a circuitous route. You didn't start off with space as a topic, but there was something that maybe, that some science fiction that you were exposed to that had you come back to space, each of you, I've heard you talk about. So what do you think, what movie or what book do you think gets it right? If if I want to read something that is sort of maybe a realistic-ish depiction of what could be, I personally really love the series For All Mankind. What do you think describes a plausible future?
That's a great one, and that's super popular, and especially folks in the space industry love that. Some of the topics that they latch onto, especially where it involves commercial companies that come out of it and different national goals and how that plays out. It feels like they've kind of peeked around the corner of some of the things that are germane in space today and have addressed it. So absolutely love For All Mankind. I'm more of a history buff than a science buff. So if folks are really interested in space, and not just space, but like the role of the government in dealing with large national problems and the role that space has played for us historically and kind of how we got the origins of how we got to this moment. There's a book, a Pulitzer Prize winning book by Walter McDougall called The Heavens and the Earth. And it's all about the origins essentially of NASA, and not just in a space context. It says, well, what was the US government in particular, its relationship with technology? And then how, in some ways, did the space race change that, where all of a sudden the technology became something that government was very interested in, and how did that in turn change us, our country, our government, and our relationship with technology? So I absolutely love that, The Heavens and the Earth by Walter McDougall.
Great. Thanks for that recommendation. Matt, any recommendations from you?
Well, I was going to say, I hear you on wanting something that's practical, but I think one of the great things about space is that it is different. I mean, it's like every other place, but it's also unlike every other place in the fact that it's inspired humans for millennia to dream really big. And so I would encourage your listeners who are maybe excited about space not to be shy about grabbing some big think science fiction and letting their imaginations roar. And in some ways that will inspire you then to try to figure out ways to take steps now that will eventually lead to that future. So I've often recalled how my dad and I watched Star Trek Next Generation when I was a kid, and I watched it now with my daughter and my wife. And is it realistic? I mean, probably not for the 24th century. I don't know exactly when we'll reach quite that level of advancement, but boy, did it plant the seeds that have led, I'm sure, to all of this. We're trying to take the first steps that we can.
Yeah. What was that quote? Man can only build what it can imagine.
Okay,
and so that's where it starts. Excellent. So definitely encourage people to get the book, Space to Grow, which is recently published as of this recording a couple months ago. How else can people stay in touch with you, learn from you, connect with you?
Great. Thanks for asking. So if you go to economicsofspace.com, just that website, that's a place where we try to gather some of the research that we're doing at HBS, at Harvard Business School. It's not just me. There's a variety of faculty engaged on this topic. You'll find Brendan there, even though he's now in the private sector as well. And we are eager to share our ideas and work with folks who are excited about this, especially if you're running a business or doing strategy for a business and want to learn more about ways you might leverage space. Please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find how to contact us right there.
Amazing. Well, Brendan, Matt, thank you so much for the work that you do and for packaging it for us and at least exposing us to some of it here and getting the conversation going. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thanks. Guys.
Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Ness, our editor, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time with another episode of Outthinkers.